August 1914, somewhere along the shell-cratered fields near Liege, Belgium. German infantry of the Kaiser's advancing army found themselves pinned down by a sound they'd never heard before. Not the slow, methodical thumping of the Maxim machine guns they were accustomed to. This was different, faster, more aggressive, a staccato rattling that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. In those first chaotic weeks of what would become the Great War, German soldiers gave this mysterious weapon a nickname that would stick for decades: the Belgian rattlesnake. They didn't know it yet, but they were facing the most revolutionary light machine gun the world had ever seen. A weapon that would transform infantry tactics forever. A weapon that an American army officer had invented, but which his own country had rejected with barely a second glance. The story of how the Lewis gun came to dominate the battlefields of the First World War is one of stubborn vision, petty bureaucratic jealousy, and the collision between old military thinking and devastating new technology. It's a story that begins not in the mud of Flanders, but in the comfortable offices of the United States Army Ordnance Department, where one man's pride would deny American soldiers the finest light machine gun of the war. Colonel Isaac Newton Lewis was not your typical inventor. Born in 1858 in New Salem, Pennsylvania, he'd spent his early years as a schoolteacher before attending West Point, graduating 11th in his class of 37 in 1884. Commissioned as a second lieutenant of artillery, Lewis demonstrated an immediate aptitude for technical innovation. His first patent came in 1888, a revolutionary artillery range and position finder, the world's first successful system of its kind. The United States Army, in a decision that would foreshadow future mistakes, declined to adopt it. But Lewis persisted. Throughout the 1890s and early 1900s, he developed ranging systems for coastal artillery, fire control systems, quick-firing field guns, even a gas-propelled torpedo. He'd risen to the rank of colonel and served on the Army's Board of Ordnance, where he gained intimate knowledge of how weapons were evaluated, tested, and adopted. In 1910, Lewis became affiliated with the Automatic Arms Company of Buffalo, New York. The fledgling firm had acquired a machine gun design from an American inventor named Samuel McLean. McLean's design had some interesting features, particularly its gas-operated mechanism and air cooling system, but it was overly complex and had been summarily rejected after cursory testing by Army evaluators. The company's backers believed McLean's basic concept could be substantially improved. They hired Colonel Lewis to do exactly that. By 1911, Lewis had transformed McLean's unwieldy prototype into something extraordinary. The Lewis machine gun was unlike anything military planners had seen before. It was gas-operated, meaning it used a portion of the propellant gases from each fired cartridge to cycle the action. A piston rod retracted the bolt upon firing. The ammunition was fed from a distinctive flat circular magazine that sat horizontally atop the receiver and rotated clockwise during firing, holding 47 rounds. The entire weapon weighed just 28 pounds, roughly half the weight of a typical medium machine gun. But the Lewis gun's most revolutionary feature was its cooling system. Traditional machine guns of the era used water jackets, requiring gallons of water and making them impossibly heavy for mobile warfare. Lewis designed an air-cooled system with a distinctive cylindrical aluminum shroud that enclosed the barrel. Longitudinal fins ran the length of the barrel inside this shroud. The principle was elegant. When the gun fired, the muzzle blast created a suction effect, pulling cool air through the open rear of the shroud, across the finned heat sink and out the front. This forced draft cooling allowed sustained fire without water, without excessive weight, and without the vulnerable coolant lines that could be punctured in combat. In 1911, the United States Army Ordnance Department agreed to test Lewis's prototype. The trials were conducted with typical military thoroughness. The gun performed relatively well, demonstrating good reliability and manageable recoil. But when the evaluation was complete, Colonel Lewis received devastating news. His gun would not be recommended for adoption or further development. The official reasons cited budgetary concerns and the fact that the machine gun served essentially the same purpose as the standardized M1909 Bene Merci machine rifle, already in inventory. But those who knew the players understood the real reason. General William Crozier, Chief of Ordnance, had developed an intense personal dislike of Colonel Lewis. Some historians suggest professional jealousy. Others point to earlier conflicts when Lewis had testified before Congress about obsolete policies and worn-out conditions in the Board of Ordnance, publicly embarrassing senior officers, including Crozier himself. Whatever the cause, the result was clear. Crozier used his position to ensure Lewis's gun would never be adopted by the United States Army. Not while he remained Chief of Ordnance. Lewis, furious and increasingly bitter, reportedly called the Evaluation Board members ignorant hacks. It was not a statement calculated to advance his military career. In January 1913, at age 54, Colonel Isaac Newton Lewis resigned his commission. He packed his belongings, gathered his 4 prototype weapons, and sailed for Belgium. Lewis arrived in Liege, Belgium's ancient fortress city and centre of its arms industry, with a revolutionary weapon and a burning determination to prove the United States Army wrong. He established a company called Armes Automatique Lewis and began negotiating with Belgian military officials. Unlike their American counterparts, the Belgians immediately recognized the weapon's potential. They ordered a batch for trials chambered in British .303 caliber ammunition, which had become something of a European standard. The trials were successful. The Belgian army, though small, was modernizing rapidly in response to growing tensions with Germany. They officially adopted the Lewis gun in 1913 and ordered it into limited production. Lewis also approached the Birmingham Small Arms Company in England. BSA, one of Britain's premier weapons manufacturers, saw the commercial potential immediately. They purchased a manufacturing license from Lewis in 1913, beginning production of what they designated the Model 1914. This decision would make Isaac Newton Lewis a very wealthy man. The royalty payments would flow for years, but more importantly, it put the Lewis gun in the right place at the right time. Because in August 1914, the world exploded into war. Germany's invasion of Belgium began on August 4, 1914. The German strategy, known as the Schlieffen Plan, called for a rapid sweep through neutral Belgium to outflank French defences and capture Paris within weeks. The Belgian army, outnumbered and outgunned, fought desperately to slow the German advance. And in those early battles, German soldiers encountered the Belgian rattlesnake for the first time. Belgian army units equipped with Lewis guns used their mobility to devastating effect. Unlike the heavy Maxim guns that required crews of 4 to 6 men and couldn't easily be moved once positioned, a single soldier could carry a Lewis gun into action. Belgian troops would set up in concealed positions, wait for German infantry to advance into the open, then unleash withering fire at 500 to 600 rounds per minute. Before the Germans could locate and suppress the gun, the Belgians would displace, moving to a new firing position and repeating the ambush. The psychological effect was profound. German infantry, accustomed to the predictable placement of heavy machine gun positions, found themselves caught in crossfires from weapons that seemed to materialize from nowhere. The distinctive sound, a rapid staccato rattle quite different from the slower rhythm of Maxim guns, became associated with sudden death. German soldiers began calling it the Belgian rattlesnake, and the name spread through their ranks like folklore. What made the Lewis gun so effective wasn't any single revolutionary feature. It was the combination of capabilities. The air-cooled barrel meant no water to carry, no hoses to connect, no vulnerable coolant system to maintain under fire. The 47-round Pan magazine could be changed in seconds by a trained operator. The bipod support provided a stable firing platform. Adjustable sights allowed effective fire out to 600 meters. The clock-type recoil spring could be adjusted to regulate the rate of fire, and perhaps most importantly, the entire system weighed just 28 pounds. A trained soldier could carry it, set it up, and bring it into action faster than any comparable weapon of the era. The Germans, professional soldiers who'd spent decades studying military technology, immediately recognized the implications. Here was a weapon that changed the fundamental calculus of infantry combat. Machine guns had existed for decades, but they'd always been artillery weapons, positioned like cannons and requiring substantial logistics. The Lewis gun was different. It gave ordinary infantry sections their own organic automatic fire support. When Belgium fell and German armies swept into France, the invaders made a point of capturing every Lewis gun they could find. German ordnance specialists examined the weapons carefully. They rechambered captured guns for Germany's standard 7.90 Mitula Mauser round. They wrote special training manuals. They included instruction in Lewis gun operation as part of standard machine gun crew training. By war's end, Germany would field nearly 10,000 captured Lewis guns, designated MG-137E, in their inventory. But the weapon's greatest impact would come with the British Army. In October 1915, the United Kingdom officially adopted the Lewis gun in .303 British calibre for both land and aircraft use. The Birmingham Small Arms Company, which had been producing the gun since 1914, ramped up production dramatically. By early 1916, BSA was churning out Lewis guns at an unprecedented rate. The factory could produce 6 Lewis guns in the time it took to manufacture a single Vickers machine gun. This production advantage, combined with the weapon's tactical superiority in mobile warfare, led to massive orders. Between August 1914 and June 1915 alone, the British government placed orders for 3,052 guns. By 1916, approximately 50,000 Lewis guns had been produced. Lewis guns outnumbered Vickers machine guns by a ratio of about 3-to-1 in British service. The weapon began reaching frontline infantry battalions in early 1916, just as the British Army prepared for its great offensive on the Somme. Initially, each battalion received just 4 Lewis guns, but as commanders recognised their value, allocations increased steadily. By 1917, each infantry section had its own Lewis gunner and backup. Battalions deployed 46 Lewis guns. This represented a fundamental transformation in infantry organisation. For the first time, small unit leaders had immediate access to sustained automatic fire without calling for support from brigade or divisional machine gun companies. The Battle of the Somme, which began on July 1, 1916, would prove both the value and the limitations of the Lewis gun in the most catastrophic way imaginable. That morning, 14 British divisions climbed out of their trenches and walked into machine gun fire. Nearly 60,000 men became casualties on that single day, the bloodiest in British military history. The German defenders, protected in deep bunkers that had survived days of artillery bombardment, emerged to man their weapons and massacre the advancing British infantry. German heavy machine guns, positioned in mutually supporting fields of fire, created an impenetrable curtain of bullets. But where British troops managed to reach and capture German trenches, the Lewis gun proved its worth. Unlike the heavy Vickers guns that couldn't be moved forward during an attack, Lewis guns advanced with the infantry. Once a position was captured, Lewis gun teams could immediately set up defensive positions to repel the inevitable German counterattacks. Private Thomas Cook of the 8th Battalion earned the Victoria Cross at Pozieres during the Somme battles. His citation tells the story. After a Lewis gun had been disabled, he was ordered to take his gun and gun team to a dangerous part of the line. Here he did fine work but came under very heavy fire, with the result that finally he was the only man left. He continued firing the gun alone, holding the position until relieved. When ammunition ran low, Cook had managed to keep firing by retrieving ammunition from disabled guns and casualties. One man, one Lewis gun, holding a critical section of trench against German counterattacks. It was exactly the scenario the weapon had been designed for. British ordnance experts estimated the Lewis gun's rate of fire exceeded 15 million rounds every 24 hours during the Battle of the Somme, which raged for 140 days from July through November 1916. The ammunition consumption was staggering. The logistics of keeping Lewis gun teams supplied became a critical concern for battalion commanders. A British ordnance publication from 1918 called The Complete Lewis Gunner laid out the weapon's importance in stark terms. A Lewis gun in the hands of good gunners will work as much destruction as 50 average riflemen. The rat-tat-tat of a Lewis gun has a great moral effect. Against a machine gun a man stands little chance, and human flesh will not face it. A machine gun has terrible killing powers. A Lewis gun gives a maximum volume of fire from a minimum of front. But the Lewis gun's impact extended far beyond ground combat. Its air-cooled design and relatively light weight made it ideal for aircraft use. In June 1912, Captain Charles Chandler of the United States Army had fired a prototype Lewis gun from a Wright Model B Flyer, making it the first machine gun ever fired from an airplane. Now, with war raging and aerial combat emerging as a new dimension of warfare, the Lewis gun became the weapon of choice for aircraft observers and gunners. The cooling shroud could be removed for aircraft use without any adverse effects. At altitude, the freezing temperatures and fast-moving air provided more than adequate cooling. Stripped of its shroud, the aircraft version weighed just 20 pounds. The flat pan magazine was perfect for aircraft use. Unlike belt-fed guns that required complex feed mechanisms, the Lewis could be mounted on a ring mount, allowing the gunner to rotate and elevate the weapon while the magazine stayed horizontal. For two-seat aircraft, where the observer sat behind the pilot, the Lewis gun on a scarf ring mount became standard equipment. British pilot Leno Hawker demonstrated the Lewis gun's effectiveness in air combat when he downed 3 enemy aircraft in 1915, earning the Victoria Cross. The ease of handling and high rate of fire made it the go-to weapon for aerial gunners throughout the war. A 97-round magazine was developed specifically for aircraft use, nearly doubling the ammunition capacity of the ground version. The Lewis gun played a critical role in one of the war's most important aerial campaigns, the fight against German Zeppelins. Until September 1916, the massive hydrogen-filled airships had been nearly invulnerable to attack. They operated at altitudes approaching 10,000 feet, too high for most aircraft to reach effectively, and when fighters did manage to intercept them, standard solid bullets simply punched small holes that caused inconsequential gas leaks. Britain developed specialised ammunition to solve the problem. Brock bullets contained spontaneously igniting potassium chlorate. Buckingham rounds were filled with pyrophoric phosphorus. Pomeroy bullets were explosive, designed to rip open the Zeppelin's envelope. Lewis guns loaded with a mixture of these ammunition types proved devastatingly effective. The incendiary rounds would ignite the hydrogen, while explosive bullets created large holes to feed the flames. Zeppelins, which had terrorised British cities with impunity, suddenly became flying death traps. Lewis-armed fighters shot down Zeppelin after Zeppelin through late 1916 and into 1917, effectively ending their usefulness as strategic bombers. But while Britain embraced the Lewis gun and deployed it by the tens of thousands, the United States Army remained stubbornly resistant. When America entered the war in April 1917, the Army still refused to adopt the weapon for infantry use. General William Crozier, still Chief of Ordnance, maintained his opposition. The Navy and Marine Corps, less constrained by Army politics, adopted the Lewis gun in early 1917. Savage Arms Company in Utica, New York, began producing the M1917 Lewis gun chambered in .30-06 Springfield, the standard American military cartridge. The Marines trained extensively with the weapon and brought their Lewis guns with them when they deployed to France. Then came one of the most controversial decisions of America's participation in the war. When Marines arrived in France and reported to the American Expeditionary Force, they were ordered to surrender their Lewis guns. These reliable, well-understood weapons were to be replaced with the French Chauchat light machine gun. The stated reason was standardization with French forces. The real reason, most historians believe, was General Crozier's continued animosity toward Colonel Lewis and his weapon. The Chauchat was widely regarded as one of the worst machine guns of the war. It was unreliable, prone to jamming, poorly manufactured, and generally despised by troops forced to use it. Marines who trained with the Lewis gun were understandably furious, but military discipline prevailed, and American troops went into combat with inadequate automatic weapons, while their British allies carried the superior Lewis gun into battle beside them. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. An American-designed weapon, rejected by America, had become the standard light machine gun of the British Empire. By 1917, every British infantry section had its own Lewis gun team. The typical team consisted of 7 men. The first Lewis gunner carried the weapon and a revolver. The second gunner carried a bag containing spare parts. The remaining 5 team members carried loaded pan magazines of ammunition. All could fire the gun if required. All could effect repairs in seconds. Private William Bullock, a Lewis gunner with the British Army, left vivid descriptions of the weapon's use in combat. On April 13, 1918, Bullock and his fellow soldiers intercepted a German advance along the Calonne-Robec road. His diary entry is matter-of-fact. "We fired the gun in turns until it was too hot to hold. 400 German casualties were caused, chiefly by my Lewis gun. The gun had become so hot from sustained firing that the crew had to rotate, passing the weapon between them as the metal cooled enough to handle. 400 casualties from a single Lewis gun position." It was the kind of defensive firepower that machine guns had promised, but which only truly portable automatic weapons could deliver in fluid combat situations. The Lewis gun didn't just provide firepower. It provided firepower exactly where and when it was needed, carried forward by the infantry themselves rather than positioned in the rear and called upon by request. Lieutenant Albert Borella, a Gallipoli veteran with the 26th Battalion, earned the Victoria Cross in July 1918 near Villers-Bretonneux. His citation describes how he led his platoon, now reduced to 10 men and 2 Lewis guns, against a very strongly held trench. Using his revolver and later a rifle, with the Lewis guns providing sustained suppressive fire, Barella's tiny force inflicted heavy casualties and captured 33 prisoners. When the Germans counterattacked twice, outnumbering his platoon 10-1, Barella's cool determination and the devastating firepower of those 2 Lewis guns held the position. The Germans were repulsed with very heavy losses. This became a recurring pattern throughout 1918 as the war finally broke free from trench deadlock. Small units, equipped with Lewis guns and led by aggressive junior officers and NCOs, could accomplish missions that would have required company or battalion strength efforts in earlier years. The weapon had fundamentally changed the mathematics of infantry combat. The Lewis gun's mechanical complexity made it vulnerable to the conditions of trench warfare. The weapon consisted of 138 separate parts. Mud, water, and battlefield debris could cause stoppages. The pan magazines, if dented, would cause misfeeds. The delicate gas system required careful maintenance, but British Army training emphasised care and cleaning of the weapon. Gun teams practiced disassembly and reassembly until they could perform it blindfolded. They learned to diagnose and clear stoppages in seconds. They understood that the Lewis gun was their lifeline, and they treated it accordingly. The Germans, who'd initially dismissed the weapon as Belgian, came to respect and fear it. German doctrine since the Franco-Prussian War had emphasised offence, the idea that Germany could win wars only through aggressive attack, not passive defence. When the Schlieffen Plan gave way to trench warfare in autumn 1914, German commanders found themselves in need of their own light machine gun to break the stalemate. They tried various solutions. The Bergmann, Parabellum and Madsen machine guns were tested, but rejected for wide-scale adoption. Instead, Germany modified its heavy MG-08 Maxim gun, creating the MG-15, a lighter version that could theoretically be carried by one man. But at 40 pounds with its bipod, plus the weight of ammunition and cooling water, it remained considerably heavier and less mobile than the Lewis gun. German soldiers recognised this disadvantage. Numerous war photographs show German troops with captured Lewis guns, treasured weapons that provided capabilities their own army couldn't match. The Germans rechambered approximately 10,000 captured Lewis guns for their 7.19 2mm cartridge. They wrote training manuals. They integrated the weapons into their machine gun companies. The Belgian rattlesnake, so feared when encountered in enemy hands, became a prized asset when captured. By 1918, the Lewis gun had become utterly ubiquitous on the Western Front. It appeared in British war photographs constantly. Soldiers posing with their Lewis guns, gunners manning the weapon from trenches, infantry advancing with the distinctive flat pan magazine visible. The weapon had become an icon, as recognisable as the steel helmet or gas mask. Production numbers tell the story of its success. The Birmingham Small Arms Company alone manufactured 145,397 Lewis guns during the First World War, add in production from Savage Arms in America and other manufacturers, and total production exceeded 150,000 units by war's end. This made it one of the most widely produced automatic weapons of the conflict. The cost was substantial, £175 per gun in 1918, compared to about £100 for a Vickers. But the Lewis gun's faster production time and tactical advantages made it worth the premium price. The weapon saw service with dozens of nations: Australia, Belgium, Canada, Czechoslovakia, Estonia, Finland, France, Honduras, Ireland, Italy, Israel, Mexico, the Netherlands, Newfoundland, New Zealand, Nicaragua, Norway, the Philippines, Poland, Portugal, Russia, Taiwan, Yugoslavia. Even Japan adopted the Lewis gun in 1929, with the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal manufacturing copies for aircraft use through World War II. It was truly a global weapon, born in America, perfected in Belgium and Britain, and distributed across every continent. The Russian Empire purchased 10,000 Lewis guns from Britain and another 10,000 from the United States, though it's unclear how many were actually delivered before the Bolshevik Revolution. Norway manufactured limited numbers in the 1930s. The Netherlands produced versions chambered in their unique .256 Mannlicher cartridge. The Lewis gun's influence extended into the development of later weapons. Its gas-operated system, its pan magazine design, its quick-change concept, all influenced subsequent generations of automatic weapons. The German FG-42 paratroop rifle incorporated elements of the Lewis gas system and bolt design. Those features were then incorporated into the American M60 machine gun, which served through Vietnam and beyond. Colonel Isaac Newton Lewis died on November 9, 1931, in Hoboken, New Jersey, at age 73. He lived long enough to see his weapon vindicate his vision and prove the United States Army catastrophically wrong in its rejection. He died a wealthy man, his royalties from British production having made him a fortune. But one wonders if financial success truly compensated for the knowledge that American soldiers had gone into combat without the weapon he'd designed for them, forced instead to rely on inferior French guns because of one man's petty jealousy. The Lewis gun service didn't end with World War I. When World War II began in 1939, Britain found itself desperately short of weapons after the evacuation from Dunkirk in 1940. Searching through warehouses and arsenals, the British discovered nearly 59,000 Lewis guns in storage, holdovers from the previous war. These weapons were pressed into service with the Home Guard, Britain's civilian defence force. They were mounted on vehicles positioned at airfields distributed to units lacking modern weapons. The Lewis gun, by then over 25 years old in design, went back to war. The Royal Navy used the Lewis gun extensively as anti-aircraft armament. Twin and even quadruple mounts were developed for motor torpedo boats and patrol craft. In this role, defending against low-flying aircraft, the Lewis gun proved remarkably effective. British sources credit it with shooting down more low-flying enemy aircraft than any other anti-aircraft weapon. Its high rate of fire and reliability made it ideal for engaging fast-moving targets at close range. British tanks initially used the Lewis gun as well. Mark IV tanks mounted them as secondary armament. But the tank's internal ventilation system created an unexpected problem. Airflow inside the tank reversed the cooling draft through the Lewis barrel shroud, blowing hot air and fumes directly into the gunner's face. As soon as improved belt feed mechanisms were developed for the Hotchkiss machine gun, the Lewis was replaced in tank service. The weapon even saw limited service in Korea and Vietnam. North Korean forces used Lewis guns captured from various sources. Viet Cong guerrillas were photographed with ancient Lewis guns, weapons that had been manufactured 40 or 50 years earlier, but which still functioned. It speaks to the weapon's robust design that Lewis guns could remain serviceable after decades of storage and neglect. Royal Naval Commandos used the Lewis gun for beach parties during amphibious operations. Australian, New Zealand, and Dutch forces carried them in the early Pacific War campaigns against Japan. Peter White, a British soldier, recorded that his battalion of the King's Own Scottish Borderers was still using Lewis guns mounted on universal carriers in 1945, the final year of the war. By this time the weapon was thoroughly obsolete, outclassed by the British Bren gun and various other modern designs. But the Lewis remained in service because it worked, because troops were familiar with it, and because tens of thousands of them existed in inventory. Even after production ended in 1942, after nearly 150,000 Lewis guns had been manufactured, the weapon continued to serve for another decade in various capacities. It was finally retired from most frontline service by the early 1950s, though examples continued to appear in conflicts around the world into the 1990s. The Lewis gun appeared during the Croatian War of Independence in the 1990s, 75 years after its introduction. It showed up during the Troubles in Northern Ireland, used by paramilitary groups who'd acquired the weapons from unknown sources. It was documented during the Arab-Israeli War of 1948. Each appearance was a testament to the weapon's longevity and the sheer number that had been produced and distributed globally. At museums and collections today, the Lewis gun is instantly recognizable. That distinctive barrel shroud, the flat circular magazine sitting atop the receiver, the bipod mount. Even people with no knowledge of military history often recognize the weapon's silhouette. It's appeared in countless films and television shows, usually in scenes depicting World War I. The Lewis gun has become a visual shorthand for the Great War, as iconic as barbed wire and gas masks in representing that conflict. For collectors, Lewis guns remain highly sought after. A legally deactivated example in good condition can sell for thousands of pounds or dollars. Aircraft-mounted versions command premium prices. Original accessories, the 47 and 97 round, magazines, the spare parts kits, the canvas carrying cases, all are collectible. Training manuals and official publications about the weapon are preserved in archives and private collections. The ammunition itself, 303 British for most examples, is still manufactured and remains popular among collectors of military firearms. At the United States Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio, a restored Lewis gun sits among displays of aviation armament. At the Anzac Memorial in Sydney, Australia, a Lewis gun is displayed with detailed information about its use by Australian forces. At the Imperial War Museum in London, multiple Lewis guns are preserved, representing different variants and manufacturers. The Cody Firearms Museum in Wyoming holds examples in its collection. Each museum display tells part of the story: the technical specifications, the manufacturing details, the combat record. But they can't fully convey what it meant to be a Lewis gunner in 1916, carrying 28 pounds of weapon and ammunition through muddy trenches, knowing that your squad's survival depended on keeping that gun operational. They can't capture the sound that German soldiers learned to fear, that distinctive rattling chatter that meant incoming fire from an unexpected direction. They can't recreate the moment when a gunner realizes his weapon is too hot to hold, but he has to keep firing because German infantry are counterattacking, and if this position falls, the whole line might collapse. The Lewis gun was a tool, an inanimate object of steel and aluminum and wood. But in the hands of trained soldiers, it became something more. It became the difference between success and failure, between holding a position and being overrun, between survival and death. The Belgian rattlesnake. The name captures something essential about how the weapon was perceived by those who faced it. Snakes strike from concealment suddenly and lethally. They're difficult to spot before it's too late, and rattlesnakes specifically give warning, that distinctive sound that tells you danger is present. The German soldiers who coined that nickname understood exactly what they were facing: a weapon that could be anywhere, that announced its presence with that characteristic sound, and that struck with devastating effect before they could react. Colonel Isaac Newton Lewis set out to create a light machine gun that could be carried by infantry and provide automatic fire support without the weight and complexity of water-cooled weapons. He succeeded beyond perhaps even his own expectations. The Lewis gun didn't just meet the requirement, it defined a new category of weapon that would dominate infantry combat for the next 50 years. Every modern squad automatic weapon, every light machine gun, every weapon designed to provide portable sustained fire at the infantry section level, descends conceptually from the Lewis gun. The tragedy is that American soldiers were denied this weapon during World War I because of one man's ego and spite. General William Crozier's obstruction kept the Lewis gun out of American hands and forced troops to use inferior alternatives. It's impossible to quantify how many American lives might have been saved if they'd been equipped with Lewis guns instead of Chauchats. How many missions might have succeeded with better firepower? How many defensive positions might have held with properly equipped machine gun teams? We can only note the irony. An American weapon, designed by an American officer, manufactured in American factories for export, became the standard light machine gun of the British Empire, while American soldiers went without. After the war, investigations and congressional hearings examined the scandal. Crozier was eventually eased out of his position. The damage was done. By the time the Browning automatic rifle was adopted in late 1918, the war was nearly over. American infantry had spent most of their combat service equipped with weapons their allies wouldn't use. The story of the Lewis gun is ultimately a story about vision and vindication. Isaac Newton Lewis saw what military conservatives couldn't, that warfare was changing, that infantry needed portable automatic weapons, that the old paradigm of machine guns as artillery pieces no longer served modern combat. He created a solution. When his own army rejected it, he took it to those who would appreciate it. The Belgian army, small but professional, understood immediately. The British army, initially sceptical, came to rely on the weapon absolutely. By 1917, British infantry tactics were built around the Lewis gun. Every plan, every attack, every defence assumed the presence of Lewis gun teams, providing sustained automatic fire at the section level. The weapon had become indispensable. When those first Belgian army units opened fire on advancing German infantry in August 1914, they couldn't have known they were demonstrating a weapon that would help win the war. When German soldiers coined the nickname Belgian rattlesnake, they were acknowledging a fundamental shift in the balance of infantry combat. The age of the rifle-armed soldier as the primary killing weapon was ending. The age of the light machine gun was beginning. And it began with the rattling chatter of Isaac Newton Lewis's revolutionary weapon, echoing across the battlefields of Belgium, France, Russia, Italy, the Middle East, Africa, and every other front of that terrible war. The Lewis gun dominated the battlefield long before anyone expected such a weapon was even possible. It changed warfare forever. And it all started because one stubborn American colonel refused to accept that rejection meant the end of his dream. The Lewis gun's tactical applications evolved dramatically as the war progressed, and commanders began to understand the weapon's true potential. In early 1916, British doctrine treated the Lewis gun almost as a miniature version of the heavy Vickers, positioning it in static defensive roles. By 1918, innovative officers had transformed it into an offensive weapon that fundamentally altered how infantry attacked fortified positions. Captain Trafford Lee Mallory, who would later become an Air Chief Marshal in World War II, was among the first to develop what became known as fire and movement tactics specifically around the Lewis gun. His concept was revolutionary for its time. While one Lewis gun team provided suppressive fire, pinning enemy troops in their positions, rifle sections would advance. Once they reached cover, a second Lewis gun would leapfrog forward while the first team displaced. This alternating bound system allowed infantry to advance under continuous covering fire, something impossible with rifles alone or with heavy machine guns that couldn't be easily moved during an assault. The Germans, watching these tactics develop, attempted to counter them by targeting Lewis gunners specifically. German snipers were instructed to prioritize any soldier carrying the distinctive weapon. The reward for killing a Lewis gunner was sometimes higher than for killing an officer. But this created its own problems for German forces. Focusing fire on Lewis gunners meant other threats went unengaged, and British units, recognizing this German priority, developed deception tactics. Dummy Lewis guns, carved from wood and fitted with scrap metal, would be carried by decoy soldiers to draw fire while real gunners approached from different angles. The psychological dimension of the Lewis gun's effectiveness extended beyond its actual firepower. The sound of multiple Lewis guns firing created the impression of a much larger force than was actually present. British raiders conducting trench raids would often bring several Lewis guns specifically for this purpose. A dozen men with 2 Lewis guns could sound like a company-strength attack, causing German defenders to call for reinforcements and creating chaos in their rear areas. The weapon's distinctive report became a form of psychological warfare in itself. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Percy Crozier, commanding the 9th Royal Irish Rifles, described an attack in 1916 where Lewis guns proved decisive. His battalion was tasked with capturing a German strongpoint that had resisted multiple previous assaults. Crozier positioned 6 Lewis guns in a semicircle around the target, each elevated slightly to fire over the heads of the advancing infantry. When the assault began, all 6 guns opened fire simultaneously, pouring nearly 3,000 rounds per minute into the German position. The concentrated fire was so intense that German defenders couldn't man their weapons. Crozier's riflemen reached the position with minimal casualties and found the defenders huddled in the deepest parts of their dugouts, psychologically shattered by the sustained automatic fire. This massed Lewis gun barrage technique became increasingly common in 1917 and 1918. Commanders discovered that concentrating multiple Lewis guns on a single target created effects out of proportion to the actual firepower involved. The noise, the visible tracers, the sheer volume of bullets impacting in a confined area all combined to suppress and demoralize defenders far more effectively than dispersed fire from individual weapons. Artillery officers began coordinating with Lewis gun teams, timing artillery barrages to lift just as Lewis guns opened fire, creating a seamless transition that gave defenders no opportunity to recover. The ammunition expenditure was enormous. During major offensives in 1918, British logistics officers estimated that Lewis guns consumed more small arms ammunition than all rifles combined. A single battalion with 46 Lewis guns, each firing at 500 rounds per minute during an assault, could expend over 20,000 rounds in just a few minutes of sustained fire. Keeping the guns fed became a critical logistical challenge. Ammunition bearers, often the unsung heroes of Lewis gun teams, would carry multiple loaded magazines forward under fire, knowing that running dry at a critical moment could doom an entire attack. The French army, which had initially been sceptical of the Lewis gun, began adopting it in significant numbers in 1917 after the disastrous Nivelle offensive. French soldiers, demoralised by catastrophic losses and inadequate equipment, were on the verge of mutiny. The introduction of Lewis guns, along with other improvements in tactics and equipment, helped restore morale. French troops appreciated the weapon's reliability compared to their own Chauchet. French cavalry units, transitioning from horse-mounted to dismounted roles, found the Lewis gun ideal for their new mission. Light enough to carry on horseback if necessary, powerful enough to provide serious firepower when dismounted, the Lewis became standard equipment for French cavalry divisions. The Portuguese Expeditionary Corps, serving on the Western Front in 1917 and 1918, equipped their units with Lewis guns supplied by Britain. During the German Spring Offensive of 1918, Portuguese positions were overrun by elite German stormtroops using infiltration tactics. But Portuguese Lewis gun teams, fighting from isolated positions after their lines collapsed, inflicted severe casualties on the advancing Germans. Captured German reports noted that Portuguese resistance was far stronger than expected, primarily due to effective use of automatic weapons. Individual Portuguese soldiers held off German attacks for hours, their Lewis guns creating small islands of resistance that disrupted the German advance. The Italian army faced a unique challenge in their mountainous theatre. Heavy machine guns were difficult to position in the rocky Alpine terrain where they fought the Austro-Hungarian forces. The Lewis gun's portability made it ideal for mountain warfare. Italian Alpini troops, specialised mountain infantry, could carry Lewis guns to high-altitude positions impossible for heavy weapons. During the Battle of Caporetto in October 1917, where Italian forces suffered a catastrophic defeat, Lewis gun teams often provided the only effective resistance as Italian lines collapsed. Survivors reported that Lewis gunners continued firing until overrun, buying time for retreating units to escape encirclement. The Russians received thousands of Lewis guns through the Archangel and Vladivostok supply routes. British and American advisors trained Russian machine gun companies in the weapon's use. During the Brusilov offensive of 1916, Russian units equipped with Lewis guns achieved breakthrough successes that had eluded them in previous attacks, but the chaos of the Russian Revolution and subsequent civil war scattered these weapons across Russia. Both Red and White forces used captured Lewis guns throughout the Civil War. The weapon's simplicity and reliability made it ideal for the poorly trained and supplied armies fighting across Russia's vast distances. When American forces finally entered combat in significant numbers in 1918, many discovered what they'd been denied. Fighting alongside British, French, and Belgian units, American soldiers saw Lewis guns in action and understood immediately what they'd been missing. Marine Corps units that had been forced to surrender their Lewis guns were particularly bitter. They watched British troops advance behind Lewis gun covering fire while they struggled with jammed Chauchats. American after-action reports from 1918 are filled with references to the superior performance of Allied automatic weapons compared to American equipment. Private Elton Mackin of the 5th Marine Regiment wrote in his war memoir about watching British troops during the Meuse-Argonne offensive. The Limeys had it figured out, he observed. Every section had a Lewis gun. They'd advance by bounds, one gun always firing while the others moved. We had the Chauchet, which jammed if you looked at it wrong. More than one Marine threw his Chauchet away and picked up a German weapon during fighting. We were supposed to be showing the Europeans how to fight, but they had better machine guns than we did because our own army was too stubborn to adopt an American invention. The German Spring Offensive of 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm's last desperate gamble to win the war before American forces arrived in overwhelming numbers, demonstrated both the Lewis gun's defensive capabilities and its vulnerability to new tactics. German stormtroops, using infiltration methods and combined arms tactics, initially achieved stunning breakthroughs. British positions that had been static for years were overrun in hours, but the Germans discovered that destroying a position defended by Lewis guns required far more effort than conventional defences. British rearguard units, equipped with Lewis guns and ordered to fight to the last, created strong points that the Germans couldn't simply bypass. Each strong point, had to be reduced, consuming time and casualties the Germans couldn't afford. During the German attack at St. Quentin on March 21, 1918, Sergeant James Macaulay of the 14th Battalion commanded a Lewis gun position that held for nearly 8 hours against repeated German assaults. His small section, just 10 men with 2 Lewis guns, occupied a shell crater and engaged German infantry at ranges down to 50 metres. Macaulay's citation for the Distinguished Conduct Medal noted that his position was eventually overrun only after both guns were destroyed by direct artillery hits, and ammunition was completely exhausted. German reports from that sector noted that this single position had inflicted an estimated 80 casualties and delayed the advance by over 3 hours. The Lewis gun proved equally effective in the mobile warfare that characterised the final months of the war. As Allied forces advanced during the 100 Days Offensive from August through November 1918, the ability to quickly establish defensive positions became crucial. German rearguard actions attempted to slow the Allied advance, forcing repeated attacks on hastily prepared positions. Lewis gun teams could deploy in minutes, providing covering fire for advancing units without waiting for heavy machine guns to be brought forward. The weapon's mobility allowed it to keep pace with the rapidly moving front lines in ways that heavier weapons simply couldn't. Australian and Canadian forces, considered among the finest assault troops on the Western Front, relied heavily on Lewis gun tactics during their advances. The Canadian Corps, commanded by General Arthur Currie, developed sophisticated combined arms tactics, where Lewis gun teams operated in close coordination with infantry sections, artillery forward observers, and light tanks. During the Battle of Amiens in August 1918, often called the Black Day of the German Army, Canadian units advanced over 10 miles in a single day, a stunning achievement by Western Front standards. Lewis guns played a critical role in this success, providing suppressive fire that allowed infantry to overcome German resistance rapidly. New Zealand forces at the Battle of Messines in June 1917 employed a tactic called the Lewis gun box barrage. Multiple Lewis guns would fire at predetermined intersecting points, creating a box of fire that isolated German positions from reinforcement. Any German troops attempting to move into or out of the boxed area faced certain death. This technique, combined with artillery fire and infantry assault, proved devastatingly effective. The New Zealand division captured all its objectives on schedule with lower casualties than expected, largely due to innovative use of Lewis gun firepower. South African forces serving in German East Africa found the Lewis gun ideally suited to bush warfare against German colonial troops commanded by the legendary Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck. The weapon's portability was crucial in terrain where there were few roads and supplies had to be carried by porters. A Lewis gun could be broken down into components small enough to be carried through dense vegetation, then rapidly assembled when contact was made. South African troops reported that the psychological effect of automatic fire was particularly pronounced against German Askari troops who had never encountered such weapons. The sound of a Lewis gun opening fire would often cause Askari units to break and flee, even when they significantly outnumbered the attackers. In the Middle Eastern theatre, British Imperial forces used Lewis guns against Ottoman Turkish armies in Palestine, Mesopotamia, and Arabia. The weapon proved remarkably resistant to desert conditions. Sand and dust, which caused constant problems for other automatic weapons, had minimal effect on the Lewis gun's gas-operated system. British troops discovered that the air-cooling system actually worked better in the intense desert heat than water-cooled guns, which required precious water that was often scarce. During the Battle of Beersheba in October 1917, Australian light horse brigades carried Lewis guns during their mounted charge, dismounting to provide covering fire as infantry advanced on Turkish positions. T. E. Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia, armed his Arab irregulars with Lewis guns captured from Turkish forces or supplied by the British. The weapon's simplicity made it ideal for guerrilla warfare. Arab fighters, often with minimal formal military training, could learn to operate and maintain the Lewis gun in days. Lawrence's raids on Turkish railways and supply depots relied heavily on the mobile firepower provided by Lewis guns. A small raiding party with 2 or 3 Lewis guns could engage Turkish patrols or garrison troops with devastating effect, then disappear into the desert before reinforcements arrived. The weapon saw service in the Balkans. where conditions were among the most primitive on any front. Serbian forces retreated across Albania in winter 1915 to 1916 in one of the war's great humanitarian disasters. Those units lucky enough to possess Lewis guns found them invaluable for rearguard actions against pursuing Austrian and Bulgarian forces. The weapon's reliability in freezing conditions, often superior to rifles that froze solid in the mountain passes, meant that Lewis gun teams sometimes provided the only effective resistance to enemy pursuit. British forces in Salonika, fighting in malarial swamps and rugged mountains, relied heavily on Lewis guns for patrol and outpost duty. The multinational Allied force in the region, including British, French, Italian, Serbian, and Greek units, created a patchwork of different weapons and ammunition types. The Lewis gun in .303 British caliber became something of a common standard, with captured weapons and ammunition shared between Allied contingents. In Africa, beyond German East Africa, the Lewis gun appeared in various colonial campaigns. Portuguese forces in Angola and Mozambique used Lewis guns against German-led raids from neighbouring German colonies. Belgian forces in the Congo employed the weapon, a fitting use given that Belgium had been the first country to adopt Lewis's design. French colonial troops in various African possessions received Lewis guns as part of British military assistance programs. The weapon's durability and resistance to tropical conditions made it ideal for colonial service where maintenance facilities were minimal and spare parts scarce. Aircraft use of the Lewis gun expanded dramatically as aerial combat intensified. The weapon's light weight and ease of handling made it the preferred armament for British and French observation aircraft throughout 1917 and 1918. The standard installation placed a Lewis gun on a scarf ring mount in the observer's cockpit, allowing 360-degree coverage. This arrangement proved so successful that it remained standard for British aircraft into the 1930s. Observers became expert at changing the 97-round magazines while in flight, often while their aircraft manoeuvred violently to evade enemy fire. Some of the war's most successful air aces flew aircraft armed with Lewis guns. Albert Ball, who scored 44 victories before his death in May 1917, used a non-standard mounting that placed a Lewis gun on the upper wing of his Nieuport fighter, firing over the propeller arc. Ball would dive beneath enemy aircraft, pull up sharply, and fire the Lewis gun upward into the target's belly, the most vulnerable part of any aircraft. This technique required exceptional flying skill but was devastatingly effective. Ball could reload the Lewis gun in flight by pulling down the drum magazine from its overhead mounting, changing it, and pushing the loaded magazine back into place. James McCudden, another top British ace with 57 victories, preferred twin Lewis guns mounted on his SE-5A fighter. The synchronised Vickers gun in the nose provided sustained fire, but the twin Lewis guns on the upper wing delivered the knockout punch. McCudden's technique was to approach from below and behind, using the Vickers to damage the target and disrupt its manoeuvres, then pull up and finish it with a burst from both Lewis guns at point-blank range. His combat reports frequently note that targets literally disintegrated when hit by fire from both Lewis guns simultaneously. The Royal Naval Air Service, which operated independently of the Royal Flying Corps until the formation of the RAF in April 1918, used Lewis guns almost exclusively. Naval pilots developed specialised tactics for attacking German submarines on the surface. Aircraft would approach at low level, often just meters above the wavetops, and open fire with Lewis guns as the submarine crew attempted to man their deck gun or dive. The .303 bullets couldn't penetrate a submarine's pressure hull, but they could kill the crew, destroy the deck gun, and damage the conning tower, optics. More than one U-boat was forced to abort its patrol and return to base after aircraft attacks damaged critical equipment or wounded key crew members. British airships, used primarily for maritime patrol and anti-submarine work, carried multiple Lewis guns for defence against German fighters. The weapons were mounted at various positions around the airship's gondola, providing all-around coverage. On several occasions, British airships fought off attacks by German fighters, with Lewis gun fire damaging or destroying the attackers. The lighter-than-air vessels made stable gun platforms, and experienced gunners could engage targets at longer ranges than was possible from heavier-than-air aircraft. The home defence squadrons that protected Britain from German bomber attacks relied heavily on Lewis gun-armed fighters. The weapon's incendiary ammunition proved effective against German Gotha and Giant bombers, which carried large fuel loads and had minimal armour. Flight Lieutenant Frederick Sowry shot down the German Navy Zeppelin L-32 over Essex on September 24, 1916. using a combination of Brock, Pomeroy and Buckingham ammunition fired from his Lewis gun. The Zeppelin, one of the most modern in the German infantry, was destroyed so completely that the wreckage barely filled a small field. All 22 crew members were killed. The psychological impact of this and similar victories effectively ended the Zeppelin threat to Britain. By late 1918, aircraft-mounted Lewis guns had evolved sophisticated mounting systems. The Foster mounting, invented by Sergeant Foster of the Royal Flying Corps, allowed the Lewis gun on upper wing installations to slide backward on rails. This enabled the pilot to reload the weapon in flight and also allowed the gun to fire upward at a steep angle, ideal for attacking from below. Some pilots learned to use the Foster mount to fire almost vertically, approaching directly beneath enemy aircraft, where they couldn't be seen, and opening fire at ranges of just 10 or 20 meters. Ground crews became expert at optimizing Lewis gun installations for different missions. For long-range patrols, the 97-round drum would be installed. For short-range defensive patrols, 2 47-round drums might be carried to reduce weight. Incendiary ammunition was loaded for anti-Zeppelin work. Armor-piercing rounds were used against observation balloons, which were heavily protected by ground fire and fighter patrols. Some specialized aircraft carried 4 or even 6 Lewis guns, creating flying weapons platforms with firepower that rivaled ground-based machine gun positions. The tactical flexibility provided by Lewis gun-armed aircraft extended to ground support missions. As the war became more mobile in 1918, aircraft increasingly attacked ground targets. Lewis gun-armed two-seaters would fly low over German positions, the observer firing at troops, vehicles and animals. The psychological effect was significant. German soldiers, already stressed by artillery and ground combat, now faced threats from above as well. The sound of aircraft engines followed by the rattling of Lewis gunfire became another terror of the modern battlefield. Anti-aircraft use of the Lewis gun expanded as aerial threats increased. British forces developed truck-mounted installations with multiple Lewis guns, creating mobile anti-aircraft batteries. 4 Lewis guns mounted together could put out nearly 2,000 rounds per minute, creating a wall of fire that few aircraft could survive. These improvised anti-aircraft weapons proved effective at low altitudes, where German ground attack aircraft operated. Several German aircraft were shot down by Lewis gunfire from ground positions, their wreckage testifying to the weapon's versatility. Naval use extended beyond aircraft. The Royal Navy mounted Lewis guns on small patrol boats, minesweepers, and auxiliary vessels. The weapon's lightweight meant it could be installed without extensive modifications to the vessel. During the Zeebrugge raid in April 1918, British forces attacking the German submarine base used Lewis guns mounted on the blocking ships to suppress fire from German defenders. Marines manning these guns kept up sustained fire despite being under fire themselves, allowing demolition parties to complete their missions. Submarine chasers and Q-ships, merchant vessels disguised to lure German U-boats, carried Lewis guns as secondary armament. When a U-boat surfaced to finish off what appeared to be a helpless merchant ship, the Q-ship would drop its disguise and open fire with hidden guns, including Lewis guns positioned to sweep the submarine's deck. More than one German submarine crew was killed by Lewis gunfire before they could man their deck gun or dive to safety. The Eastern Front saw extensive use of captured Lewis guns by all sides during the Russian Civil War that followed the Bolshevik Revolution. Red Army forces, White Russian forces, and various nationalist armies all used whatever weapons they could capture or purchase. Lewis guns were particularly prized because ammunition could often be obtained from multiple sources. The weapon appeared in the hands of Czech Legion troops fighting their way across Siberia, Polish forces battling both Soviets and Ukrainians, and Baltic independence movements fighting for survival. In Ireland, during the War of Independence from 1919 to 1921, the Irish Republican Army acquired Lewis guns through theft and purchase from British Army stocks. IRA units used these weapons in ambushes of British forces, with the Lewis gun's firepower often making the difference between successful attacks and disaster. The IRA's flying columns, mobile units that conducted hit-and-run attacks, would typically include at least one Lewis gun in their armament. British forces in Ireland responded by restricting access to Lewis guns and ammunition, but weapons continued to disappear from armories and were never recovered. During the 1920s and 1930s, the Lewis gun appeared in conflicts worldwide. Chinese warlord armies used thousands of Lewis guns purchased from various sources. The weapon saw service in the Chinese Civil War, used by both nationalist and communist forces. Its robustness and reliability made it ideal for Chinese conditions, where maintenance facilities were primitive and supply chains unreliable. Japanese forces captured Lewis guns during their campaigns in China and Manchuria, studying the design and incorporating features into their own machine gun development. The Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1939 saw Lewis guns on both sides. Republican forces used weapons supplied by the Soviet Union and purchased from international sources. Nationalist forces used Lewis guns captured from Republican arsenals or supplied by their German and Italian allies who had themselves captured the weapons in World War I. The weapon proved its worth once again in Spain's brutal infantry combat, though by this point it was clearly obsolete compared to more modern designs. When World War II began, the Lewis gun was pressed into emergency service as Britain scrambled to arm its forces after losing most of its modern equipment at Dunkirk. The Home Guard, Britain's civilian defence force, received approximately 59,000 Lewis guns from storage. These weapons, some nearly 25 years old, were cleaned, tested and issued to units tasked with defending Britain against German invasion. Training pamphlets were hastily printed. Ammunition was brought out of long-term storage. Men who had used the weapon in the previous war trained a new generation in its operation. The sight of Home Guard units training with Lewis guns became common in Britain during 1940 and 1941. Photographs show middle-aged men, many of them veterans of World War I, manning the same weapons they'd used at the Somme or Passchendaele. The weapon that had once been revolutionary was now obsolete, but it could still kill. And with German invasion seeming imminent after the fall of France, any weapon was better than none. The Lewis gun, designed in America, rejected by America, adopted by Belgium and Britain, had come full circle to defend British soil against the same enemy it had faced a generation earlier.